My name is Teresa. I am 48 years old. My brother stood at my Army retirement ceremony and described my career to his children as digging up old bombs in the desert. I had manually diffused 112 improvised explosive devices across 3 combat deployments. I had watched 3 of my teammates be carried off tarmacs in flag-draped transfer cases. I had spent 22 years performing a job that most civilians cannot spell correctly, let alone explain. I stood beside my brother in a photograph that afternoon, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling, and I smiled for that camera with everything I had, and I did not say a single word. That was November. By the following July, I was in Gary's backyard in Nashville at a summer cookout, and I was still not saying a word. That afternoon changed things. I did not change them. I didn't have to. The thing about silence is that it only protects you until someone else decides to speak. And when the man who had served 2 doors down from my team in Kandahar walked through my brother's back gate carrying a 6-pack and a quiet kind of recognition I hadn't felt in years, the silence I had been keeping for 2 decades had about 45 minutes left to live. This is how I got there. I grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, which is a military town in the way that certain towns are military towns, meaning the base is the largest employer. The boys in your high school talk about enlisting the way boys in other towns talk about trade school. And the presence of Fort Campbell is so woven into the air of the place that you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of highway traffic outside your bedroom window. My father was a Vietnam veteran who didn't talk about Vietnam in any way that resembled talking. He mentioned it occasionally, in fragments, when something on the television startled it out of him. Otherwise, he ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. He coached my brother's Little League team until Gary was 12. And he sat in the same chair every evening after dinner with a cup of coffee and a crossword puzzle that he rarely finished. He was not a soft man. I don't mean that unkindly. He simply expressed love through proximity, through showing up. He drove me to school every morning, even when the bus route passed our front door. He came to every swim meet, every academic competition, every school play in which I had one line and delivered it directly into my shoes. He was not a man who said, "I am proud of you." He was a man who was there, and in my family that was the same thing, and I understood it even then. Gary was 3 years older than me. He was the one who stayed. When I enlisted at 18, Gary was already enrolled in a construction management program at Middle Tennessee State. He was going to build things. He was going to employ people. He was going to make his name in the county in a way you could point to and say, that was Gary. He did all of those things. He was good at them. He married a woman named Linda who was kind and patient and who made the best cold pasta salad I have ever tasted in my life. He built a contracting business that eventually employed 64 people and generated what he always called a healthy 8-figure revenue. He told you about the revenue early. He'd worked hard for that number and he wanted you to know it was real. He was not a bad man. I want to say that clearly and I want to mean it. Because nothing I'm about to tell you will sound like I believe it, but I do. Gary loved me. Gary was proud of me in all the ways he could manage. He simply could not manage all the ways. When I enlisted, the recruiter placed me in a battery of aptitude tests on a Tuesday afternoon in a room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and old coffee. I scored in the top 2% for mathematics and spatial reasoning. He walked me through the job options the Army had for someone who scored the way I scored. And when he reached Explosive Ordnance Disposal, he looked up from his paperwork and said, "This one's worth considering. You'd be good at this." I didn't know what EOD was. Most people don't. Most people hear the words and picture something from an action movie. A man in an enormous padded suit crouching over a ticking device while a digital clock counts down to 0. The reality is more interesting and significantly less cinematic. EOD technicians are the people who find, render safe, and dispose of explosive threats. Improvised explosive devices, unexploded ordnance from conflicts that ended decades before we arrived, vehicle-borne devices, booby traps constructed from salvaged artillery shells and fertilizer and doorbell wire and whatever else was available, suicide vests, objects that were built by human beings with the specific intention of killing other human beings, left in the ground or hidden in vehicles or attached to the undersides of bridges or wired into the door frames of buildings, waiting. My job for 22 years was to find them before they finished waiting. There is no machine that does what an EOD technician does. There are robots, and we use them, and they extended our reach and kept us out of direct exposure in situations where direct exposure was survivable by robot and not necessarily by person. But the robot has no judgment. The robot does not read the ground. The robot cannot tell the difference between the pressure plate that is inert because it has been sitting under 8 inches of compacted earth for 6 months and the pressure plate that is inert because someone is watching from a hillside and waiting to see whether you will send the robot or whether you will come yourself. There were situations in which the only tool equal to the problem was a human being who could assess, adapt, and decide in real time with incomplete information and inadequate sleep and the knowledge that the thing they were walking toward had been built specifically to end them. That is not a dramatic description. That is the accurate one. I trained for 2 years before my first deployment. EOD school is located at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and it is one of the longest initial training pipelines in the United States military. The course at the time was approximately 11 months of technical instruction, followed by 6 months of field training and evaluation. Roughly 50% of candidates who entered did not complete it. The attrition was not a function of physical fitness. You were not washing out people who couldn't run fast enough or lift enough weight. You were washing out people whose minds did not work correctly under the specific type of pressure the job required, which is not the same as washing out people who were not smart or not brave. It is a specific and unusual quality of mind that EOD demands, and either you have it or you don't, and finding out which takes time. You are learning to slow your nervous system down at the precise moment every instinct in your body is screaming at you to speed up. You are learning to be systematic in situations designed to produce panic. You are learning that there are 2 categories of mistake in this work, and they are not similar mistakes on a spectrum. There are mistakes from which you learn, and mistakes from which you do not get the chance to learn, and the entire purpose of training is to narrow the second category down as far as it will go, knowing that it will never reach 0. You are learning that the difference between being alive and not being alive sometimes comes down to whether you noticed one detail that every reasonable part of your brain was trying to look away from. I did not find this terrifying. I found it clarifying. I understood for the first time at EOD school what it meant to have a job that was exactly the size of the particular person you happened to be, where the requirements were so specific and your abilities so precisely matched to those requirements that showing up felt less like effort and more like fit. My instructors noticed. They pushed me harder because of it, the way good teachers push the students they can see. And I was grateful for the pushing even when I did not feel grateful in the moment. I graduated in the top 15% of my class. I did not call Gary to tell him. I called my father. He said, "Good." That was the whole sentence. Just good. And I understood. My first deployment was to Iraq in 2003. I was 26 years old and I had been trained until training felt like breathing. And I still remember the specific quality of the air when the cargo door opened at Balad Air Base. The heat that hit you not like a wall, but like a decision the atmosphere had made about you personally. I had been briefed. I had studied the threat environment. I had done everything a person could do to prepare for the work. None of it tells you what it actually feels like to approach your first device. My team chief on that first deployment was a man named Dominic Okafor. Sergeant First Class Dominic Okafor from Columbus, Ohio, who was 34 years old when I met him and had been doing EOD work for 12 years already. He had a daughter named Kezia, who was 7 years old, and he kept a photograph of her in the breast pocket of his uniform, always, the way some men keep cigarettes. He showed it to me on the first day, not as an introduction exactly, more as a statement of fact. He said, "I go home to this," and then he put the photograph back in his pocket and briefed me on our first mission. Dominic was the best I ever saw at the work. He was not reckless, and he was not cavalier, and he was not the kind of person who used the danger to make himself feel large. He was precise, he was quiet. He had a particular stillness about him when he was working that I came to understand as not the absence of fear, but the mastery of its timing. He had decided, somewhere back in those 12 years, that fear was a tool that had its proper use and its proper moment, and the moment for it was after, not during. During, you worked. After, in the quiet of the vehicle on the way back, he would say something small and funny and not about what had just happened, and then you would eat your food and sleep your hours and come back and work again. He taught me everything I know about staying alive. He was killed in the summer of 2009 by a secondary device in a village outside Mosul. He was working a route clearance when the first device detonated. He moved in to assess the damage, and secondary blast triggered. He was 39 years old. Kezia was 14. I did not learn about it in real time. I was on a different assignment. Someone told me 2 days later, sitting in a common room on a forward operating base, and I received the information the way you receive information in that environment, which is to say that I put it in a place inside me where it could not touch the work, because the work had to continue. Because the work was the only thing standing between the devices and the people walking the roads. And Dominic, of all people, would have understood that before he would have understood grief. I called Gary from a satellite phone 3 days after I heard. It was 4 a.m. in Tennessee, and he answered immediately, the way people do when they have a family member deployed and the phone rings at 4 a.m. I said I was fine. I said someone on my team had died. Gary said he was sorry. Then he said, "This must be like when we lost Henderson on the job site." Henderson was a man on Gary's crew who had fallen from scaffolding and broken his collarbone. He had been in the hospital for 3 days and had returned to work with a brace and a bad attitude about workers' compensation forms. He was alive and complaining when I called my brother from a satellite phone at 4 a.m. to tell him Dominic Okafor was dead. I said, "Yeah." I said something like that. I said I had to go. I hung up the phone and I went back to work. I am not telling you this to indict Gary. I'm telling you this because it is the pattern. And patterns only mean something when you can see all of them together. They don't feel like much one at a time. One comparison between construction risk and EOD risk is a man reaching for understanding across an experience gap that he cannot cross. The 10th time, over 15 years, across 3 deployments, it starts to feel like something else. I'm still not sure I have the right word for what it feels like. Erasure is too dramatic. Reduction, like watching someone take everything you lived through and put it in a jar that is slightly too small, and then hand the jar back to you and say, "Here, I've kept it for you." My second deployment was to Afghanistan in 2007. We were working out of a forward operating base in Kandahar province. The threat environment in Afghanistan was different from Iraq in ways that mattered technically and in ways that mattered to your nerves. The devices were more sophisticated. The terrain was harder. The routes were less predictable. We were working 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours in a day, and the days ran together the way days do when there is no weather change and no calendar event, and the rhythm of the work is the only rhythm your body knows. I had been promoted to staff sergeant by then. I had my own team. I led 3 soldiers into the field every day, and I was responsible for bringing all 3 of them back in the same condition they had arrived in. That is the sentence that people don't hear when they hear the word leadership. They hear command, they hear authority. What they don't hear is what it means to spend every working hour of your life with the knowledge that your decisions and your judgment are the things standing between these 3 people and the worst phone call their families will ever receive. I kept a small notebook in those years. Not a journal, exactly. I don't write well, and I never have. But I wrote down the names of the devices we cleared, not the technical designations. The names my team gave them. We gave them names because naming things gave you some small measure of control over them. Some human claim over objects that existed purely to end human things. 212 devices over 3 deployments. I know the exact number because I counted. I counted for no one's benefit but my own. In the same way that you keep track of some things not because anyone is asking, but because not keeping track feels like a different kind of surrender. In the spring of 2011, in Kandahar province, a device I was working detonated partially. I was close enough that the concussive force knocked me onto my back in the dirt. I had a cracked rib on my left side. I had a bruised eardrum in my left ear. And in the months that followed, I developed a very slight tremor in my right hand that comes and goes depending on temperature and fatigue. It is barely visible. Most people never notice it. In cold weather, it becomes somewhat more pronounced. My right hand trembles slightly when it is cold, and when people ask about it, I tell them it is an old occupational injury from years of heavy equipment work, which is technically true. I have never told anyone it was from a blast. Not Gary, not my former teammates, most of whom guessed and never pressed. Not the doctors at the VA who asked about it at my intake appointments and accepted occupational injury without follow-up. I don't know entirely why I don't talk about it. I think partly it is because talking about it means explaining the whole day, And explaining the whole day means explaining Afghanistan. And explaining Afghanistan means explaining what EOD work actually is. And I have spent too many years watching people's faces in the middle of those explanations to trust that they end well. They don't end badly. They end with something I don't have a word for, a kind of polite revision, where the person reclassifies you as someone interesting rather than someone real. I came home from my third deployment in 2013, and I did not redeploy. I took a training billet at Fort Lee, Virginia, and I spent 9 years teaching EOD, teaching the people who would do what I had done in whatever new configuration the world would present to them by the time they got there. I was good at it. I was possibly the best classroom instructor I'd ever seen, which I say not to flatter myself, but because I had been trained by Dominic Okafor, who had been the kind of teacher who made the people he trained better than himself, and I owed him that. Teaching was its own kind of hard. You were not in the field. Your nervous system knew the difference, even when your brain tried to tell it otherwise. There is a particular restlessness that finds EOD technicians when they leave field work, a low-level vibration that does not have a name in the medical literature, but that every person who has done that work and then stopped will recognize immediately. Your hands know how to do something that your daily life no longer requires. Your eyes have been trained to look for a specific category of thing, and in the absence of that thing, they sometimes flag ordinary objects. A pressure difference in the road surface, a wire at an unusual angle, a bag left against a wall, and your mind goes briefly somewhere that the grocery store parking lot does not require it to go. I managed this the way most of us managed it, which is to say, imperfectly and without much acknowledgement. I drank too much coffee. I arrived everywhere 15 minutes early and used the surplus time to survey exits. I drove the long way home more often than the short way, not for any reason I could have articulated at the time. I kept the old truck running past the point where running required more effort than it was worth, because it was the one mechanical thing in my life I understood completely, and I was not ready to introduce uncertainty into that particular relationship. Dee and I talked about these things in the oblique way. We talked about most things in the margins of other conversations, in the moments after a third cup of coffee when the guards come down slightly. We did not call them symptoms. We called them habits. The language mattered because the language was a door, and some doors you open and some you leave alone. And the skill is knowing which is which and being honest with yourself about your reasons. I called Gary most Sunday evenings from Fort Lee. The calls were 15 or 20 minutes. He told me about the business. I told him about the training program. He asked how I was doing, and I said fine, and he accepted it. Because Gary accepted what I gave him. Because he had not yet asked for the real version, and I had not yet offered it. That was the shape of us for 9 years. Neither of us knew it had a different shape available. I retired in November of 2022 at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, in a ceremony that lasted 90 minutes and included a slideshow of photographs from my deployments that I had carefully curated to include nothing that would require explanation to a civilian audience. Gary came with Linda and the kids. He sat in the third row. He was the only member of my family present, and I was glad he was there. When they called his name to receive the brigade commander's family appreciation certificate, he stood up straight, and he walked to the stage and he shook the general's hand, and I could see from where I sat that he was moved. I could see it in the way he held himself. He was proud of me. He didn't know what he was proud of, not precisely, but the pride was real. Then they handed him the microphone. He talked for about 4 minutes. It was not a bad speech. He talked about what it was like waiting for phone calls during deployments. He talked about the fear of watching news coverage from countries with names he had to look up. He talked about being proud of his little sister, and the way he said it was warm and genuine, and I believed every word of it. And then he said the thing about digging up old bombs in the desert, and the room made the soft, appreciative sound that rooms make when a speaker delivers a line that lands gently, and the children at the tables wrote nothing on their faces, because they were children and they were storing the information without having any system yet to know what to do with it. Old bombs in the desert. I stood up and received my retirement flag and my shadow box of career decorations, and I thanked my commander, and I shook the hands of every person in that room, and I smiled for every photograph, and I felt the November cold working on my persidan. Right hand under my wool dress gloves, that familiar quiet shaking that nobody could see. And I thought about 112 devices and 3 caskets and a satellite phone at 4 a.m, and I smiled. We had dinner afterward at a steakhouse in Clarksville. Gary ordered the ribeye and told the story of his largest contract to date, a mixed-use commercial development in the Germantown neighborhood of Nashville. $42 million, the most complex project his company had ever taken on. He talked about it the way he always talked about work, which was with a specific and detailed affection for its difficulty, for the number of variables that had to be managed simultaneously, for the coordination required across dozens of subcontractors. He was genuinely proud of the work. I listened and I asked questions, and I meant the questions. Gary was good at what he did, and I respected that. At some point during the dinner, he looked at me and said, "I don't know how you did it, honestly. The risk alone would have killed me." And then, before I could respond, he added, don't get me wrong, construction is dangerous too. We had a man fall 3 stories on the Germantown project, ended up fine, but still, you're in a different category altogether. He meant it as a compliment. I received it as one. I said thank you. I ordered the salmon and ate most of it and took the rest in a box and drove 2 hours back to my apartment in Nashville, where I had moved earlier that fall in preparation for post-retirement life. And I sat in my kitchen at 11 at night with a cup of coffee that was too strong and too hot, and I thought about Dominic Okafor, and then I stopped thinking about Dominic Okafor. Because thinking about Dominic Okafor at 11 at night, alone in a kitchen in Nashville, was a road that didn't end anywhere useful. My friend Denise had been trying to get me to a therapist for 3 years. Denise had served with me at Fort Lee after we both came back from our 3rd deployments. She was from Memphis, originally, and she had the kind of directness that Memphis produces in certain people, a specific combination of warmth and absolute refusal to tolerate nonsense. She had done her own work, as she called it, with a VA counselor in Clarksville, and she reported that it had been useful in the way that she said useful, which meant not everything she hoped for, but more than she expected. She brought up the subject approximately once every 6 weeks and then dropped it without pressure, which is how she had managed to keep raising it without me shutting the door on the conversation entirely. D, I called her. D was my person, in that specific way, that the military makes certain people your people, where you have shared a particular quality of pressure together and survived it, and afterward, you do not need to explain things to each other. We could sit for an hour in a room and say approximately 11 words and leave having said everything that needed to be said. She was a small woman with a laugh that seemed structurally impossible for her body to produce. Enormous and sudden and completely without warning. She had 2 daughters in middle school and an ex-husband she referred to only as the renovation project, because she said he had potential, but the timeline kept slipping. She was the one who drove down with me to Gary's backyard in Nashville on the last Saturday of July, 2023. The cookout was a thing Gary did every summer. He had the kind of backyard that got better every year, because Gary applied the same attention to his property that he applied to his work, which was to say that there was always something new, a pergola, a built-in grill, a small water feature along the back fence that he had designed himself and which he explained at length to every person who visited for the first time. The grass was cut at the kind of angle that requires specialized equipment. Linda's hydrangeas were performing extraordinary things along the fence line. Everything Gary touched had that quality of tended excellence that you either find deeply satisfying or faintly exhausting depending on your particular wiring. I arrived 15 minutes early, because I always arrive everywhere 15 minutes early, which is a habit the Army installed in me permanently and which I have made no effort to uninstall. I arrived to find Gary at the grill and Linda in the kitchen, and Tyler, Gary's 12-year-old, attempting to teach his 9-year-old sister Emma a card game that neither of them fully understood. I sat at the patio table with a glass of water and watched them argue about the rules, and I felt what I always feel when I am at Gary's house in the summer, which is a particular kind of warmth and a particular kind of loneliness, the 2 things existing simultaneously without canceling each other out. D arrived at 12:30, precisely on the minute of the invitation, because D operates on a moral framework in which arriving at the stated time is the only correct option. She appeared at the back gate with a bowl of pasta salad and her enormous laugh already happening in advance of anything funny, which was simply how she entered rooms. She hugged Linda. She made Emma show her the card game. She sat next to me and said, in a voice low enough for only me to hear, "How are we doing?" And I said, "We're fine." And she gave me the look that meant she received that information and intended to revisit it. At some point before noon, Gary had been talking with a couple of neighbors about project management when the man who taught history at the high school asked me what branch I had served in. I told him Army. He asked what I did. I told him EOD. He said, "Oh, like the movie." I said I hadn't seen the movie. He said it was supposed to be very realistic. I said that was good to know. Gary came over with his tongs. He said Teresa was bomb disposal. He said it with genuine pride. He said, which is basically the most dangerous job in the military. He looked at me for confirmation and I said there were a few contenders. He said, right, but bomb disposal is up there. And the thing is, Gary said to the history teacher, EOD is not that different from construction in terms of risk management. He said, in construction, you're always working with materials that can kill you if you don't respect them. Electricity, structural loads, heights. He said, it's not the same, obviously, but the mindset is similar. I was holding my water glass, I held it, and I looked at Gary, and I thought about every word I could say, and none of them were the right ones in this moment at this table with these people, and I looked at Gary's face and saw the pride in it, the genuine wanting to connect these two things, pride, and I said, it's a good mindset. Dee was standing 3 feet away with her pasta salad, and she did not look at me. Later, when Gary had gone back to the grill, Dee came to stand next to me at the fence, and she said, quietly, he does it every time, doesn't he? I said, he means well. Dee said, meaning well and getting it right are not the same thing. I said, I know. She said, you could tell him. You could actually tell him. I said, I know. She was quiet. She said, how long have you been coming to these cookouts? I counted back. I said, about 12 years. She said, Teresa. I said, I know. She didn't press further. That was the thing about Dee. She could make the full case in 7 words and then rest the subject without closing it. And you both knew the subject was not gone, only waiting. I had been thinking, in the half hour before Marcus arrived, about leaving early. Not because anything was wrong, exactly. Gary was a good host. Linda made excellent food. The kids were loud in the comfortable way kids are loud when they are happy and supervised. But there is a particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep, that accumulates in rooms where the version of yourself that the people around you believe you to be does not quite match the actual version. I had been in those rooms enough to recognize the onset of it. The feeling that the distance between who you were and who they believed you to be was not going to close on its own, and you were once again going to drive home carrying the gap. I was thinking about the drive home when the back gate opened. Gary's neighbors had been arriving in steady waves since noon. I had met most of them before. People from the neighborhood who knew Gary through the usual channels of proximity and block parties and shared opinions about landscaping. There was a couple from 2 doors down who were both pediatric nurses. There was a man who taught history at the high school and who had a very firm opinion about gas grills that he had been sharing for approximately 45 minutes. There was a retired couple from the house directly behind Gary's who brought a lemon cake that was extraordinary and who left promptly at 2:30 because of what they called a standing obligation, which everyone understood to mean afternoon television. Gary was in the middle of telling the story about the Germantown project when the back gate opened and a man came through who I did not recognize. He was, I would guess, somewhere in his early 40s, solidly built in the way that certain men are solidly built when the muscle comes from actual labor rather than gym schedules. He was carrying a 6-pack of bottled beer and wearing a plain dark t-shirt and the kind of calm that some people walk around in that takes it. He caught Gary's eye, and Gary waved him over and said, "Hey, good, I'm glad you made it." He introduced himself around the group in the way that people introduce themselves when they have been to many rooms with many strangers and have learned the specific economy of it. His name was Marcus. He had moved into the neighborhood 3 months earlier. He and Gary had met when Gary came over to welcome him and ended up staying for an hour talking about the driveway renovation Marcus was planning, which was how Gary made most of his friends. Gary worked through the group, Linda and the kids, the history teacher, the nurses. When he reached me, he said, "And this is my sister, Teresa." Marcus looked at me, and something in that look was different from the way people look at me when they hear my name and my relationship to the host. It was not the polite recalibration of stranger encountering stranger. It was recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has seen you in a particular context and is now encountering you in a different one and is quietly assembling the overlap. He stood slightly straighter. He said, "Teresa, what?" I told him my last name. He said, "Staff Sergeant Teresa." Gary said, "Oh, you two know each other?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was still looking at me and I was looking at him, and I was running the same calculation he was running. Going back 10 years, going back to Kandahar, going back to the compound with the blown out southern wall and the road with the double culvert where we'd pulled 240 pounds of homemade explosive out of a drainage pipe on an August morning in 2013. He said, "I was Special Forces, 3rd Special Forces Group. I was based out of the same forward operating base as your sister's EOD team for about 7 months in 2012 and 2013. Gary said, "No kidding." Marcus turned to Gary and he said, "Your sister saved the lives of 12 men in my unit on a morning that none of us expected to see the afternoon." The yard was not silent. The kids were still on the lawn. The history teacher was still holding his beer. The gas grill was doing what gas grills do, but the conversation at the patio table had shifted to a different frequency. Gary said, "What do you mean?" Marcus said, "I mean exactly what I said." Then he took his phone out of his pocket. I knew what he was doing before the phone was fully out. There is a photograph from August of 2013 in Helmand Province, taken by a soldier in Marcus's unit whose name I no longer remember. And in that photograph, my team is standing in front of a crater approximately 8 feet in diameter and 4 feet deep. The crater is what remained of the device we had cleared that morning, the device that had not cleared cleanly. The device that had been wired into a secondary trigger that I had identified approximately 30 seconds before it detonated at a distance of about 22 feet from where I was standing, at a moment when 12 Special Forces soldiers were positioned in a perimeter around the site, in patterns that would have put at least 8 of them inside the lethal radius. In the photograph, my face is covered in black smoke and dust. I am holding a set of wire cutters in my right hand. I am looking directly at the camera with an expression that I have studied in the photograph many times since and still cannot entirely describe. It is not triumph, it is not relief, it is something quieter and less legible than either of those things. It is the expression, I think, of someone who has just finished one calculation and has not yet begun the next one. Marcus laid the phone on the patio table. Gary's son, Tyler, had drifted over from the lawn during the conversation. He was 12 years old and he had the particular radar of 12-year-olds for moments when the adults at the table are discussing something that matters. He looked at the photograph. He looked at me. He looked at the photograph again. He said, "Dad, what is Aunt Teresa doing in that picture?" Gary picked up the phone. He looked at the photograph. He looked at me. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the photograph again. His 12-year-old son was waiting for an answer. Gary opened his mouth and closed it. He put the phone down on the table. He picked it up again. He was a man who was good with words in the specific context of business, who could speak for 45 minutes about a construction project and hold a room, and he was sitting at his own patio table on a Saturday afternoon in July, and he could not find a sentence. Tyler said, "Dad?" Gary said, he said, "She was part of a..." He stopped. He said, "This was in Afghanistan." Tyler looked at the photograph again. He said, "But what was she doing? Like specifically?" Marcus said, "Your aunt was making sure that the road was safe for people to walk on." Tyler looked at Marcus and then at me with the direct and uncomplicated assessment that 12-year-olds are capable of before they learn to soften their looking. He said, "So she found the bomb?" Marcus said, "Yes." Tyler said, "And she took it apart." Marcus said, "Yes." Tyler said, "By herself." Marcus said, "She led a team." "But yes." Tyler looked at his father. He said, "Dad, did you know about this?" Gary's wife, Linda, had come out of the kitchen at some point during this exchange and was standing near the back door, holding a serving spoon and not moving. Gary said, "I knew she did important work." He stopped. He said, "I knew she did important work." Tyler said, "That's not the same as knowing about this." He was 12 years old, and he was right. Dee reached under the table and put her hand on my knee for a moment. I did not look at her because I was watching my brother's face and I was seeing something in it that I had not seen in 22 years of knowing Gary as an adult. Something cracking. Not dramatically, The way things crack when they have been under pressure for too long. A fine fracture, barely visible, but structural. Gary said, "Can I?" He looked at me. He said, "Can we talk for a minute?" We went to the far end of the yard, near Linda's hydrangeas, away from the table. The kids had gone back to the lawn. Dee was talking to Marcus about something I couldn't hear. Linda had gone back inside. Gary stood with his arms crossed and then uncrossed them and put his hands in his pockets. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "You don't have to." He said, "No, I need to." He said, "Old bombs in the desert." I stood up at your retirement ceremony and said, "Old bombs in the desert." I said, "You didn't know." He said, "I didn't want to know." I looked at him. He was looking at the hydrangeas. He said, "Do you want to know something I've never told you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "When Dad was in the hospital, the last week," he said, "the night before the end, I went in alone and I sat with him for about an hour. He wasn't talking much by then. He was mostly sleeping. But at one point he woke up and he looked at me and he said her name. He said, 'Your name.' He said, 'Teresa.' He said, 'She's my greatest pride.'" I didn't say anything, Gary said, and then he closed his eyes, and that was the last real thing he said to me. I stood in the backyard next to the hydrangeas and I looked at my brother. He said, "I know what you're going to say. You're going to say he was proud of both of us." I said, "He was." Gary said, "Probably." He said, "But that's not what he said." He said, "Teresa." He said, "She's my greatest pride." He said, "I've been carrying that for 6 years. I've been carrying it and I didn't know what to do with it. And I think," he said, "I think I have been making you smaller than you are because I couldn't figure out how to be large enough to stand next to you." He said the words fast, the way people say difficult things when they have been storing them long enough that the pressure has made them nearly automatic, not rehearsed, pressurized. I thought about old bombs in the desert. I thought about the retirement ceremony in the cold November air and my right hand trembling under my dress gloves. I thought about Henderson, who fell off the scaffolding and landed mostly okay. I thought about Dominic Okafor and Sergeant Reyes and Corporal Whitfield and the photograph from Helmand Province and Tyler's face when he looked at that photograph, the completely unguarded recognition in the face of a 12-year-old who had just discovered something real about someone he thought he already knew. I thought about what our father said from a hospital bed in the last real hour of his life. Gary said, "I don't expect you to." He said, "I know I haven't." He stopped. He was not a man who cried easily. He was not crying, exactly, but something around the edges of his face was working hard. He said, "I drove up to Fort Campbell for your ceremony because I was proud of you. I really was. I just didn't know what I was proud of. I was proud of a version of you that was smaller than you actually are, because a smaller version of you is easier to stand next to without feeling like I had been standing still my whole life." I said, "You haven't been standing still." He said, "I've been building things you can see and touch and point to and tell people what they cost." I said, "That is not nothing." He said, "I know it's not nothing." He said, "But it's also not what you've been doing." I said, "Gary." He said, "I want to know." He said, "I want to know what you actually did, not the version that fits in a toast at a retirement dinner. The actual thing." I looked at him for a moment. My brother, 51 years old, standing in his own backyard by his own hydrangeas, asking me for something I had never given him because he had never asked and I had never offered and we had never known how. I said, "It's going to take longer than this afternoon." He said, "I have the rest of the summer." I said, "Some of it I can't tell you." He said, "I understand." I said, "Some of what I can tell you is going to be hard to hear." He said, "I expect it is." I stood there for a moment. The kids were laughing about something on the lawn. The grill was still going. Dee's laugh had erupted from somewhere near the table in the way it always erupted, enormous and unexpected and complete. I said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." We stood by the hydrangeas for another moment, not quite ready to go back to the party, but understanding that we would, that we had time now, that 22 years of compressed silence does not unpack in one afternoon in a backyard, but it can begin to unpack there. It can begin anywhere. Two people decide they are ready to hold the actual weight of each other's lives. We went back to the table. Gary poured himself a new beer. He sat down next to Marcus and he said, "I'd like to hear about 2013, if that's something you're willing to talk about." Marcus looked at him for a moment, and then he said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, I can talk about that." Tyler came over from the lawn and sat at the edge of the table without being asked. Emma came too, a few minutes later, and leaned against her mother's chair. And Gary sat forward with his elbows on the table and his beer in both hands, and he listened. He really listened. I watched his face through the parts that Marcus told, and through the parts that I added, and through the long, quiet moments where no one said anything, because some things have the kind of weight that requires a moment before the next. Verd. Linda brought out the lemon cake from the retired couple down the street, and we ate it slowly in the late afternoon light, and Tyler asked questions that 12-year-olds ask when they are genuinely trying to understand. Questions that went straight to the center without the cushioning that adults use. He asked what it felt like to walk up to a bomb. He asked if I had ever been scared. He asked me if the people who built the bombs knew that the bombs might not work. I told him the truth. All 3 times. Dee drove home before dark. She hugged me at the back gate and said, in my ear, in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, "That was a long time coming." I said, "I know." She said, "Call me tonight." I said, "I will." She got in her car and I watched her go, and then I went back to the table where Gary was still sitting with Marcus, and they were talking about something that had nothing to do with deployments or devices or any of it. Something about the driveway renovation. And I sat down and I listened, and I was tired in a way that felt different from the tired I usually carried home from Gary's cookouts. A different quality of it, cleaner. I stayed until 9 o'clock. Gary walked me to my truck, an old Ford pickup I had been driving since 2015, and which had been mechanically questioned by every person who had ridden in it in the past 5 years, and which I had no intention of replacing because it ran and I knew exactly what it needed. And I had learned long ago that familiarity with a machine is its own kind of reliability. Gary looked at the truck for a moment, and then he looked at me. He said, "I'm going to do better." I said, "Gary, you don't have to make it a resolution." He said, "I know." He said, "I'm doing it anyway." I said, "Okay." He said, "Can I call you this week?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Not to talk about anything specific, just to call." I said, "Yes, Gary, you can call me." He hugged me the way he used to hug me when we were kids, both arms, the full thing, the hug that doesn't account for whether you're in public or whether other people are watching. And I stood in my brother's driveway in Nashville at 9 o'clock on a July evening, and I let him. I drove home on the interstate with my coffee thermos wedged between the seat and the console, the way I always drove, the country music station on low, the lights of the city shrinking in the rearview mirror. My right hand was steady on the wheel. July is warm, and I don't shake in the summer. I thought about our father in his hospital bed saying her name. I thought about Dominic Okafor showing me a photograph of his daughter Kezia in the first hour we knew each other. I thought about Kezia, who is now 29 years old and who I had seen once at a memorial service for her father when she was 19, and who had looked at me with a directness that felt like her father's directness and had said, "He talked about you. He said you were going to be the best he'd ever trained." I thought about 112 devices and 212 devices and 3 caskets and a satellite phone at 4 in the morning and a retirement ceremony in November and old bombs in the desert and a photograph from Helmand Province and a 12-year-old boy who asked the direct and honest question that 12-year-old boys ask when they haven't learned yet that some questions make adults uncomfortable. What is Aunt Teresa doing in that picture? I drove for a while without thinking about anything in particular. The radio played something I didn't know well enough to sing along to, and I drove anyway, and the night was warm, and the road was clear, and the old truck did what it always did, which was run. I thought about what Marcus had said at the table, when Tyler had asked him directly what it meant that Aunt Teresa had saved 12 people. Marcus had thought about the question for a moment before he answered. He had put his beer down. He had looked at Tyler with the specific seriousness of a person who takes the questions of 12-year-olds seriously, which is a quality that not all adults have and that is more valuable than most adults realize. He had said, "Your aunt made a choice more than 200 times over 3 deployments to walk toward the thing that everyone else was walking away from. Not because she wasn't scared. I can promise you she was scared, because anyone who says they weren't scared is not telling you the truth. She did it because she understood that her fear was less important than what happened to the person behind her." Tyler had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So it wasn't about being brave." Marcus said, "It was exactly about being brave." He said, "Brave doesn't mean not scared. Brave means deciding that something matters more than the scared part." Tyler had looked at me then, across the table, with a new kind of looking, the kind that takes a moment to adjust to when you're not used to it. And I had held it and not looked away. That is what I was thinking about when I turned off the interstate and drove the last 6 miles home. I parked in my spot behind the building. I sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off and the windows down and the night air coming through. The thermos had been empty since Murfreesboro. My right hand rested on the wheel. Gary was going to call this week. He was going to ask me about the actual thing. I was going to have to figure out how to say it. 22 years of it. Not all of it. Some of it I would keep because some things are yours to keep. But the shape of it, the weight of it, the thing it was, old bombs in the desert. I sat in my truck for a while and then I went upstairs. There are people in the world who do the work that keeps other people walking on roads without thinking about what might be underneath them. They do it without announcement. They do it without press coverage and without ticker tape parades and without most people knowing what the job is called. They do it because the training found them, or they found the training, because somewhere in the long testing process of their lives, it was revealed to them that they had the particular architecture for it. The nervous system that slows when everything screams to speed up. The mind that finds the single relevant detail in the 10 seconds before everything becomes irrelevant. They do this work and they come home and they go to cookouts and retirement ceremonies and steakhouse dinners and they smile in photographs and they do not correct the people who love them and cannot find them from the description. They do not do this out of martyrdom. They don't do it because they are waiting to be discovered or because the silence is secretly comfortable. They do it because explanation requires a listener who is ready to hear. And readiness is its own kind of timing. And the timing was not always right, and the work always was. Teresa is 48 years old, and she drove home from Nashville in July with her windows down and her coffee thermos empty and her right hand steady on the wheel. She had told her brother that it would take longer than one afternoon. She had said she had the rest of the summer. She had said, okay, that is how it begins, sometimes. Not with a dramatic uncovering, not with a confrontation, not with a scene, with a man standing slightly straighter when he hears your name, with a photograph on a phone at a patio table, with a 12-year-old asking the honest question, with your brother's arms around you in the driveway at 9 o'clock, the full hug, both arms, the way it was when you were kids, with the word okay said twice, meaning something it hadn't meant before. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. She made that decision 212 times over 3 deployments. And she made it again in a different way, in a backyard in Nashville in July, when a man she served with stood up straight at the sound of her name, and the silence she had been keeping for 22 years was finally given permission to end. Nobody had asked her to keep it. She never told anyone she was keeping it. That was not a failure of language or nerve. That was the shape of a life that spent itself entirely on the thing that was required, and trusted, somehow, that the people who loved her would eventually find their way to the real version. Some of them do. Some of them need a photograph and a man who was there, and a 12-year-old who doesn't know yet that some questions make adults uncomfortable. Some of them need a July afternoon and a long drive home and their brother's voice on the phone that week, calling for no reason, just calling. That is enough. That is, in the end, exactly enough.